and welcome to the Soul Learning April webinar. I want to start today with giving a little bit of an intro. We've been having some back dialogue before we all let you in. David is going to go through a different kind of style than we're used to today, and I'm looking forward to the change in format. And I will remind you about the title of this is How Can Safety Professionals 10 Times Their Organizational Learning? David has agreed to forego the very long list of credentials because it takes real estate away from his what he wants to accomplish in his content. We will be taking questions via chat, and if you want to unmute as we go through, because this is going to be a very interactive type of presentation. So with that, and without further ado, I will leave it to Dr. David Proven, where it is 1 a.m. where he is, and we are very grateful that he stayed up long enough to be able to present to our community. So thank you very much for your support as well, David.
No problem at all, Bob. Wonderful welcome. Good morning, everyone. Very good morning over here in Melbourne, Australia. So it's Thursday, 1 a.m. And so let's kick off. Maybe because there was no introduction there, I'm the chief executive of a company called ForgeWorks. We're a consulting, training, and software company in safety. I've had about a 20-year career in global vice president safety level roles in oil and gas, in engineering and construction. And I did my PhD research titled What is the Role of a Safety Professional? So a long career of practice, but also quite a lot of time thinking about the role of health and safety professionals. And so today what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about our role, but more so about organizational learning in relation to safety. We talk a lot about learning. In fact, we're here as part of the community of human and organizational learning. So it's what it says on the tin. But learning can sometimes be a little bit like culture, in that we say this word a lot and we don't often think about what it is, and more importantly, how we do it in our organization. So I don't have any slides. Doesn't mean that I'm not prepared, but I wanted to sort of let us experience a learning interaction that might be a little bit different from people feeling talked at. So what I'd like to start with, for those of you who would, is if anyone, you're welcome to come off mute and raise a question, or you're welcome to type in the chat. But if there's any specific questions or topics that you had in mind when you saw the title of this webinar and you were coming along today, that you'd like to make sure that I talk to or cover in our time together, I'd love to get a few of those up front as we get started, as opposed to you sitting there waiting 20 or 30 minutes to ask them at the end. So please feel free to do that in the chat, or anyone who'd like to come off can do that. Although assuming that there may not be any questions, I will also just get started. So we've been talking a lot about organizational learning for more than 2 decades. So Jim Reason, in some of his early safety culture work in the 90s, talked about a safety culture as being a learning culture, among other things that he described. And over the last 20 years in safety science, we've talked a lot about learning. And I've lost count of the number of times I've heard organizations say, we want to be a learning organization, we want to learn better. And still today, it's something that organizations struggle a lot with. So today, what I'm going to sort of step us through is talk a little bit about what is organizational learning, how that relates to specifically safety learning. I'm going to talk about what it's not, because sometimes we call things learning that is not learning. I want to talk about what it needs. So what are the enablers of learning in an organization? And that lets us start to think about process design. I'm going to talk about how learning relates to a lot of the safety practices that we perform as health and safety professionals, but also that other roles perform as well. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we engage our leaders in creating that environment for that priority, the resources and the environment for learning. And then what I'm also going to do before I finish up is just talk about some real world case studies that I've been involved in that might give you some more specific practical ideas for your organizations about things that you might want to potentially experiment with. Thanks to Brian and Barbara and James for those topics, and it's hopefully quite close to what we are going to go through. So, organizational learning. One way we can define organizational learning is the creation, the transfer, and the retention of knowledge over time. And so that's at an individual level, an organizational level, but particularly at an organization, we've got to think about, so what does it mean to create knowledge over time? What does it mean to transfer and share that knowledge over time? And what does it mean to retain that? And we talk a little bit about institutional knowledge, which is how we actually take what people learn as individuals and translate that into organizational knowledge and capability. So when I thought specifically about safety learning, using that as a definition, it led me to sort of define safety learning as how we create, transfer, and retain knowledge about safety risks and controls, and how that's linked to the work, which is influenced by organizational factors. And so why I put so much in that definition, because when we think about safety, it has to be about the understanding and the management of safety risks. It also has to be about the linking of those risks to the operational work that is performed in an organization. And it also has to be about how that operational work is shaped or influenced by organizational factors. So we're starting to define some boundary or scope of things that we want to understand better in our organization, and things that we want to be able to make more common and more shared, and hopefully more transparent, stable, and sustainable in our organization. What it is not communication, and it's not compliance. And a lot of the learning, quote unquote, that we do, or things that we do that we call learning, is barely communication and even compliance. So, for example, if you have an incident in your organization and you do an investigation and you prepare a lessons learned document, and the use of lessons in most of those documents is probably not appropriate, and then you send that communication to a bunch of people with a bunch of compliance actions, that's not learning. It's not effective communication, because effective communication is all about shared understanding, and that is not about creating shared understanding. And it's definitely not really about deep compliance, because deep compliance is about understanding and delivering on the intent. So at best, that process I've just described is a transactional surface level compliance activity inside an organization. So we can start to think about organizations that say, why are we not learning from our incidents? My conclusion to that in most organizations that I've been exposed to is because you don't actually have a learning process around this. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So if that's what it's not, let's talk about a little, and we've defined what learning might be at an organizational level in relation to safety. Let's talk a little bit about what learning, what it needs. Learning needs time. Learning is not something that, always can happen very, very fast, particularly when we're exploring complex topics, when we're involving diversity of perspective, when we're challenging our assumptions and our mental models, and we're integrating new knowledge into our existing knowledge and constructing new ways of seeing the world and navigating the world. So it takes time. It needs to have a process wrapped around it. So this is where And you'll start to see when I go through these things that learning needs, you might go, oh, gee, we maybe don't spend enough time on this specifically. Or you might go, oh, now I'm starting to wonder if we do actually have a process. Learning actually also requires interaction with people in the world around us. When it comes to understanding our organization, learning about our organization, it needs to involve interaction with people in the world around us. It means that we need to think about learning as a verb. Learning is something we do. So, how much does our process involve that interaction? It needs to involve the creation of new knowledge or the application of knowledge in new contexts. So, this creation of new knowledge is really important. And if I cycle back to my overly simplified comments about lessons learned documents, we should really challenge ourselves to, have we created new knowledge, or are we just reinforcing and resharing stuff that we knew, but maybe someone, didn't do. So there's no real new knowledge generated there, and there's unlikely to be the application of that knowledge in new contexts. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do all of this in a moment. Change. So learning is really interesting because if nothing changes, we haven't learnt anything, because learning should lead to change. It should lead to change in organizational functioning, change in organizational behavior, change in individual decision-making, and action in our organization. So evidence of learning should show up in material or observable changes to the way that the organization functions. And this is a little bit different to how we might think about learning technical content, where it is more a knowledge acquisition. Organizational learning is about change. It needs to be able to be sustained. So to do that, some of you may have heard of concepts like double loop learning. That's where we actually improve, where we learn about a situation, but we actually then also learn about what's underneath that situation, what's giving rise to that situation being present. We can think of this as systems thinking. We can think about this as organizational function. And there's some research in the institutional studies literature about organizational function logics. But what we need to do is be able to move from just the surface level understanding about a situation to a deeper level of understanding how that situation came to be. Because to sustain learning in an organization, we can't just reinforce surface level understanding. We actually need to change the way the organization functions. And that includes underlying assumptions, goals, norms, and a range of things. And when I talk about some practical examples, hopefully I'll make some of these things more clear. In relation to safety, when we sit back and reflect on all of the safety practices that we have in our organization, the things that we perform, potentially, if you're a health and safety person, the things that you perform, or the things that other people perform in the interest of safety, I can make an argument that every single thing we do in safety is or should be a learning process. The reporting and investigation of incident is primarily should be a learning process. Our performance indicators, metrics, dashboards, and reporting systems should primarily be about learning about the current functioning of our organization. Audit processes is learning about the way that work is performed. Every site visit should be about learning about current context and conditions and the factors shaping work. Any work as done studies or in the notes learning teams, you can make an argument that every safety practice should primarily be a learning and change practice in our company. So then you can start to think about how well designed these processes are to achieve that, going back to my earlier example. So this really makes a core role of the health and safety profession, catalyst of organizational learning. some of what I regard as the better work on the health and safety profession was done by Professor David Woods up at Ohio State. Coincidentally, the location of this year's CHOL conference in June up in Columbus. And he did some work with NASA after the Columbia Space Shuttle incident, where they had him come and review the NASA safety organization. And he proposed this model of, the 4 eyes of a safety organization. And he said that, and when we go underneath this model, like I'm going to do now, you can see it's all about learning and change. He said that a safety organization needs to be both independent and involved. So we need to be independent enough, socially, cognitively, organizationally, to be able to see things in a way that the people who are close to the action don't see. So we can bring the opportunity to create new knowledge and new models of work and new understanding of risk to the operation. But we need to be involved enough to be able to shape the ways of thinking and the decisions and the actions of that operational unit. So you can see how this is very much a learning to change type of role. And also, the other 2 eyes of the model were that the safety team should be both informed and informative. So we need to be informed about what's going on, but we also need to, help the business to be able to understand the way it functions in a way different to what it currently thinks is going on. So that model and a range of other work into the health and safety profession really promotes this idea that as safety professionals, we are nothing if not facilitators of organizational learning processes. So how can we get our leaders more engaged in learning within our organization? The first is we need to help our organization understand the value. I think every organizational priority starts with the value that it creates for the organization. So, we can talk a lot about the need to learn, but in doing work with some organizations recently, senior leaders are getting a little bit frustrated in all this talk about learning from some of the leaders that I interact with. They're saying, yeah, we know we need to learn, but their frustration is because they're saying, but we're not sort of seeing any value or any change in our organization as a result. Lots and lots of potentially learning teams, lots of things, but it's like, well, what value's been created from this learning? And their evaluation of value translates into what's changed in the organization and what's the positive impact of that change on organizational functioning. So we need to be able to help explain and the value of learning by helping them understand what an end-to-end organizational learning process looks like. We need to help leaders understand their role in how they actually promote organizational learning as a priority and how they create a supportive environment for knowledge sharing. We also need to help them and the organization sort of understand this shift. And I really like this language that's used in the organizational literature around moving from an individual sort of blame logic to an organizational function logic. And I know many of you will be familiar with human and organizational performance, but this is a much deeper model that talks to that double loop learning, how we can start to really have our organization fascinated about organizational functioning, irrespective of, the actions of an individual at a point in time. The next thing sorry, Bob.
Yeah, I was going to acknowledge in the chat, you have a question from Michelle.
Wonderful.
Any suggestions on how to shift the organization's inclination to learning about individual events, to learning more broadly about those events, and how the organization is set up for those events to happen? Yeah.
So, Bob, what I might do is I might just put a little pin in that, because one of the scenarios and examples and case studies I'm going to share is hopefully specifically to that question that Michelle's asked, if that's okay. So I'm going to get to that. I'll change the order that I was going to do the case study discussion in to get to that really shortly.
Thank you.
So the last few things that we need to help our organization, our leaders with is the process that I've mentioned a few times in this talk already. So we say learning, but are we able to show our organization what that learning process looks like, or learning processes actually look like end to end, and how we're going to effectively facilitate them in our organization? And then, as with any organizational priority, organizational change, there's the demonstration of impact. And that's where I see organizations at the moment, in some ways, struggling to, even companies that are using a lot of, I guess, more contemporary learning processes, learning teams, for example, to really demonstrate the impact. And then lastly, about utilizing technology. There is actually quite a lot of technology solutions that can really help with the analysis and the sharing and the institutionalization of new knowledge and existing knowledge in new contexts. So let me talk about a few examples, and we'll see from there. So you questioned, Michelle, about how do we move from learning about individual events to learning more broadly? Did some work with one organization, and that example of the how do we learn from events? And it's fine to learn from incidents, as much as we also want to have a proactive priority on learning about normal work, and preventing incidents should always be our first priority as a safety professional. When things happen, it is also a great opportunity to learn. This organization was attempting to share and learn from about 200 events a year. So that process I described, they were sending information out to every site 4 to 5 times a week. Stuff they needed to maybe understand and stuff they needed to do. And no change to the work environments, no meaningful change to the work environments, repeat events. And so what we did with them was go to a monthly learning topic for sites globally. So you might have 15 or 20 events in that month, but that doesn't mean you have to tell every site about every event and get every site to do something about every event. So what they then did was actually look through what are the 15 or 20 things that have happened in our organization in the last month. What do we think that means to your question, Michelle, about more broadly about the organizational conditions that's basically setting up for these events to happen, and creating learning scenarios and learning processes that sites can then work with for the next month. So it goes out to the site at the start of the month, and they get the whole month to work through that particular aspect of organizational functioning in relation to their site. Importantly, with the learning process, though, is you don't tell people what to do in terms of the action they need to take. What you actually want them to do is have a process where they can create some new knowledge for themselves, or they can think about how knowledge gets applied in their context. So by all means, send compliance activity to your sites if you want to, but don't consider that part of your learning process. So in this process that we built with them, is what they send out to sites is a facilitation pack with training and everything you'd wrap around that as well. But really sending out a scenario that's built off the actual scope of what's trying to be learned in every operation. And so at the local level, what all the sites there do is they actually go through and workshop and explore a series of questions. For example, how could this scenario or a similar type of scenario situation or a similar type of situation happen at our site? What are the different ways that we think that this particular scenario would play out? How likely or unlikely do we think that this particular situation could be for us and why. Why do we think it's likely and why do we think it's unlikely? What are some things that we want to learn more about and explore and understand? What action, perhaps do we want to take? What would we like the organization to better support us with at our site? And then their process actually makes all of the individual sites learning then transparent to every other site. So every other site can see what every other site has learned and explored and connect directly and share horizontally across their organization. And from a double loop learning perspective, the sites then work through and understand how things can apply in their context. So they're creating new knowledge and they're looking at applying knowledge in their own context. But the organization is also getting all of that learning from all of the individual sites back to start to think about, oh, now we've got a whole bunch of new knowledge about what the sites are seeing in the way the organization functions, and we can apply that in our context at an organizational level. So that process has moved beyond sending safety alerts out for every event. It's just not something that they do anymore. So hopefully, Michelle, is the way to change from moving from the inclination to try to learn from an individual event. You can still investigate that and take action locally, but in terms of mobilizing an organizational learning process, my advice there, Michelle, would be design a process that doesn't let the organization focus on individual events. So that's one. Sorry, Bob.
If I could ask a question, and
Sure.
in light of today's the scenario where we're at today with a high turnover rate, when you're looking at institutional learning and ways that it's conveyed, ways that it's internalized, how do you keep up on understanding all of these processes that we should have in place? How do you handle the fact that the high turnover rate, we have so many people coming and going? How do I sustain it?
Yeah. So, Bob, it's the way that I'd think about that is if the organization only knows what's in the heads of the individuals in the organization, then that's a real challenge in that scenario, because knowledge is walking out and people are walking in that don't have that knowledge. So organizations function on business processes. So there needs to be a way for our current understanding of how we want the organization to function to be built into business processes. So I think that somewhere through a learning process from a change and a sustaining the change point of view, the knowledge needs to live somewhere in the organization. And so whatever that looks like in your organization, I think it needs to, and it's really hard to say what that looks like. There's definitely technology solutions, business processes, a range of sort of different ways of trying to do that. But I think that is one of the bigger challenges, Bob. I don't think I've done a great job of answering that. Apologies for that.
Michelle has her hand up, so we'll release the mic to Michelle.
Sure.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Dave. Actually, I think my question was a little bit more kind of between both what you answered, Dave, and kind of more of what you were asking, Bob. Really, my question was more around, I'll just use the example. My organization is really good at learning from individual events. We've got a cut hand or we've got a burn or whatever. We're really good at learning from those. But when I zoom out, what my question was more around was, how do I get my senior leaders to kind of start recognizing that the reason we've had an increase in injuries or potentially serious process safety events might be linked to some of the decisions from an organizational standpoint that they've made, i.e. we had, workforce reductions a couple of months ago. We've had, we keep having to cut capital budgets. That's kind of where my question was a little bit more targeted. Any thoughts?
So, yeah. So maybe by way of example, and this might not be maybe as helpful, but I think our individual incident investigation processes lack depth of learning about events and making their way all the way back to what's created the condition for this event to occur. To give you an example, I was involved in an independent investigation of an electrical arc flash incident. And the initial investigation by the company had a trained person had worked on live equipment when they weren't meant to, which was a compliance breach, and they hadn't worn the PPE they were meant to wear, and they got an 11,000 volt arc flash burn, serious burns. And that was the conclusion. You can understand the sort of actions that flow from that and the learning or the surface level learning. When I went in and investigated that incident, to cut a long story short, the underlying conditions was this was a government utility organization that had been sold to an investment bank. The investment bank had introduced time objectives around the work scheduling system, customer satisfaction objectives, and cost reduction objectives. And this is teams of people that had never been exposed to those sorts of competing goals and challenges, and with the threat of losing their job through layoffs, they made the decision to try to do something quickly to try to please a customer, to get the work done. So, my conversation with that board was much more about when you bought this company, you didn't think about how you were making these organizational decisions and processes and targets that you didn't see had anything to do with safety, but have now translated in this event. And the only reason this event occurred is nothing to do with a decision of a competent person, but to not follow a procedure and to not wear equipment. And they didn't have the equipment because they weren't intending to not follow the procedure. But you set them time, cost, and customer objectives and made a really big deal out of those. So I think, Michelle, our investigation processes in safety, in my opinion, are really quite poor for a range of reasons. But I don't think we do a great job of it. And if we don't do a great job, it's really hard for us to have and hold that conversation with our executives. So hopefully that, Michelle, might be a little bit closer to the question. So when you said, sorry, Bob, please.
I'm just doing the chat questions that are coming up.
Yep.
We have another one from Brian Gestring, which I'll try to truncate. It says you discussed showing organizational leaders the value of organizational learning. Brian's a career investigator with the NYPD. He says, I'm not a safety person, but curious how you do this for publicly traded businesses where their desire to return shareholder value exceeds the delivery of a quality product. Well, I don't know how I'd answer that.
Yeah, I mean, organizations want to be sustainable. So even organizations that are quite fixated on shareholder value want to return shareholder value over the long term as well as over the short term. And so there's a few points I make here. One is that we need to be quite judicious with our learning resources. We can't probably do as much learning. We might not have 100 learning facilitators that we suddenly recruit into the organization and do it. So the way of showing value is to, I think, pick one or two known problems in the organization or known challenges in the organization that are known but tolerated or ignored because maybe they're a little bit too hard or difficult, or no one's really ever tried to work through them. And even if it's just one of those, is to focus on that until it's understood and changed in the business. And by showing that value given back to the organization, the operation, by making that improvement, we'll hopefully get maybe more resources, more time, more attention. Because every organization wants to function better. And we think of better sometimes, or I think of better sometimes in the context of safety. But as Eric Holnagle would say, work can't be going well and badly at the same time. So a lot of the things we do to make work safer makes it more reliable, makes it more predictable. And that's good for quality and cost and schedule and a bunch of other things. So if we can improve the work, then hopefully we can deliver a range of value outcomes, including safety and cost and time and those types of things. So that would be my only comment there. Maybe, Brian, is find one problem and see if you can show the organization the positive contribution of an effective learning process. So maybe I'll share one other case study, and then we'll have more time for questions. I want to share a learning from normal work study, because this is a little bit different to learning from incidents, but it was triggered by some events which made this organization really stop and consider what it was doing with its learning processes. So this organization did have a very serious event, one of the most serious events that an organization can have. And this happened in one of their locations in one part of the world. And they'd done a lot of communicating, and a lot of actions had flown around the world. And then I think it was between 6 and 9 months later, they had an event in almost the exact same way at another location in a different part of the world, other side of the world. That organization was quite concerned about that, because they were like, we've been talking about this for 6 or 9 months. We've been focusing on it. We've had teams, we've had resources, we've had everything. How could it get to the point where that could happen again? But you imagine that learning and that change, this is a little bit to your point, Bob, has to make it around the world and then all the way down to people who are actually executing work in an operation, right? And that's an incredibly hard challenge. But that was the triggering event. But what we actually did was we actually did quite an intensive normal work learning process around that. And we talk a lot about learning teams, but we had a sort of learning teams themselves. I think they're very valuable, but they can be a little bit like distant from the work. We bring people into a room and we facilitate a conversation, and it can sometimes be an sort of it's difficult to make that it's difficult to reveal the tacit knowledge that people know about their work by asking them to talk about their work. So what we did was we did a whole bunch of shadowing and learning teams. So we spent multiple shifts observing this exact work being done. And then based on those observations, we'd run a learning team and we'd talk through, why and how things were the way that they were. Then we went back and did another couple of shifts of observation of the same work again. Then we came back and did learning. We did this over several weeks of watching the work and that, until we had and at multiple sites, actually 3 different sites, until we had a very deep understanding of exactly how that work happened and what was shaping all of the decisions and choices and actions and ways that was being done. What then sort of surfaced was a whole bunch of I guess what's called performance shaping factors at an organizational level. And what that resulted in that organization, that organization changed team structures, numbers of people on teams, the relationships between teams, who had access to what types of information, the work patterns, the time that was allocated to tasks and roles, and completely redesigned the work and the organizational support processes around that work, like literally changing roles and structures and information flows. And this is where I think the learning really needs to play out into change, that if we want to really do organizational learning, that's the sort of extent of the effort that goes into creating the knowledge around in safety, from the definition at the start of this, creating the knowledge around the risk and how it connects to the work activity, and how the organizational functions shape that. And so, Dinesh, you mentioned, don't know the name there, sorry, that shadowing someone, how do you avoid people changing how they do their job when you're being watched? I think, look, there's a range of communication techniques. Many of you will be familiar with Edgar Schein's humble inquiry work. If you become sort of just part of the wallpaper, people can only sort of change from normal for sort of so long before they go into it. I mentioned several weeks, and you know, that was night shifts and weekends and 2 o'clock in the morning and talking to people about their kids and their sport and what they do and asking them questions and showing an interest in their work. And I've always found people, you know, once they start to realize who you are and what you're about, you can get a pretty open and honest engagement and understanding fairly quickly. If you turn up for 15 minutes, it's not going to happen. But I think that's my only you know, point there is really about the time. And I mentioned that first up when I said, what do we need for an effective learning process? It's time, which means, you know, like with any finite resource, such as, you know, time, is we need to be deliberate in where we invest it. And so, you know, organizational learning can't be spread too thin. It's better for it to be deep rather than broad. It's better for us to pick 1 or 2 things in the next 6 months that we really want to deeply understand, create new knowledge around that, apply that knowledge in a range of different contexts, and institutionalize that change into our organization, and then move on to the next thing that we really want to learn about. Thanks for sharing there, Jeanette, about contextual interviews and a range of techniques that allow us to understand work. So that was all I was going to share in terms of like the talking part of this. Love to get more questions or to see if I can help with anything that I haven't covered that you might be interested in. And I'm just yeah, Bob.
Can I ask another? I feel like I'm consuming all of the question time. I noticed that there's several other RCA colleagues of mine on here, but what are the fundamental differences between a learning team and a root cause analysis team?
I think these I'd be talking about my assumptions and my understanding of what I think those things are. So I'm probably not the most qualified person to talk about that, but fundamentally for me is that we could also call it a focus group. It's group-based learning. It's got its roots in the learning literature. Learning teams is just a name for something, and some people have built specific processes around how to facilitate those learning teams. But for me, there's a particular scope there's a particular scope. So there is something that we want to understand better than we do at the moment. And we bring a group of people together to try to generate that knowledge and that understanding. And so, you know, RCA as by name and RCA in practice, I think are very different things. I think the sociologic team, Brian Hughes and the team there, I think they do a fantastic job of bridging the gap between RCA and learning teams. But yeah, I don't think I'm answering Bob other than saying these are sort of labels and you know, sort of go back to what's the design of the process, and is that process generating new knowledge about health and safety risk, how it connects to work, and how and what are the things in the organization that are shaping that work to be the way that it is.
Thank you. I'm along the same lines as Brian Hughes, and we get confused by the labels oftentimes as to you know that a learning. We when we do RCA and you include the socio-technical kind of stuff, you get past the human, you get into the systems. It's just unfortunately, you know, we consider that a part of being a learning team, but in fairness to those that see RCA differently, that it's only a broken broken equipment stuff. That there are a predominance of people that is what it is. So you know, we have a public relations problem too.
Yeah, look, and language matters a lot. And so, you know, even as we think about you know, learning, and organizations are changing their incident investigations to be event learnings. So some organizations are changing language, but they may not be changing the process. So it's like, you know, Rose by any other name type of well, maybe it's the opposite of might as well as sweet as a rose, but it's this idea that, you know, I'm really about the process. You know, what I want to look for is that, like I said, are we creating new knowledge, or are we applying knowledge in new contexts that's giving us a better understanding of how our organization functions, which enables us to then use processes, structures, resources, you know, and other systems to make and sustain change.
Okay.
And
thank you.
Yeah.
I think you have one more from Brian on there.
Yeah, so Brian, so this idea about learning teams. So you know, I think I love the idea of a learning team not necessarily being tied to an issue or an incident. The challenge there, though, is that if something's not seen to be a problem by the organization, we're already talking about some of the difficulty in investing organizational effort in that. So at least if there's a underlying issue, even if it hasn't become an event, it can help to get organizational priority and resources to do something about it if it's a known challenge in the organization. If I went in today and said, I just want to go and do a learning team about leadership succession planning in my organization. And I want people from HR, and I want the CEO involved, and I want a whole bunch of people and new leaders involved. And people start going, but why? And so we'd have to have a question of why, you know, how will we answer the why? And I think that's always the difficult piece there. So I love the idea of genuinely just being curious about any aspect of the way our organization functions, because there will be definitely something to learn and change with any aspect of you know, the functioning of a socio-technical system. But I would worry about being able to get the organizational support for why that's the most important thing to spend time on when I've got issues over here and issues over here type of thing. So that's just more of a practical challenge that I'd find difficult, as opposed to not thinking it's valuable to do that.
Yeah, I agree with that in the sense that there's a whole bunch of regulatory drivers for things that we have to react to, but there's not regulatory drivers making you do stuff proactively.
Yeah. But there is, and the possible exception to that would be, you know, trying to learn about what we see to be organizational successes. And I was quite cautious about that language of what we see to be successes, because just like we say in safety, we shouldn't judge safety based on outcomes like our recordable injury rates or something like that. Nor should we judge success based on there being no injuries and things like that. So one example I give is that the Deepwater Horizon, the Transocean drilling rig that I guess was you know, the rig involved in the Macondo well blowout in 2010, the well that it drilled before that was deeper, was more technical, was on time, on budget, with no safety incident. So you could say that that's an incredibly successful project, and that. So I also love the idea of going and learning about success, because what I'm curious about with success is what we might want to learn about the trade-offs that were present to create that success. So even I would love to go to an organization and say, hey, you just did this project and it was the fastest ever project that you delivered, and get the organization, let's go and do some learning about this, because we need to understand if that's what contributed to that, and I guess what we need to learn from that. So that would be a lot of fun as well. Any other questions?
I think we have one more.
Oh, James.
Yeah.
Thanks for the and I know James well. Thanks for the question, mate, at 10 minutes to 2 a.m. in the morning. So the ideal specification for organizational learning. Wow. So but if I understand specification, James, there, I'm sort of thinking about a process or a structure or resources. But if I just think about a process, you know, I'd step through some of the things that I've sort of already said. Like if it was an organizational learning process, there would need to be, you know, a scope of the learning. You know, what is it that I'm trying to create new knowledge about, or what knowledge am I trying to understand in what different contexts? So I would always start with a statement of, I was going to say a problem statement, but a scoping statement. So I want to know what is it that I'm actually trying to be at the starting point of this learning process. Then the second point is, you know, how am I going to go about creating that knowledge? And that's always going to be a combination of conversation, observation, you know, exploration. So, you know, it's always going to be about exploring lived experience of individuals connected to that particular scope. It's always going to be combining those people together to understand that. It might be a little bit of, you know, historical kind of exploration of artifacts and things like that. So there'd be a sort of a data gathering sort of phase consistent with that scope. Like what I said, could be job shadowing. It could be whatever the scope lends itself to. There's going to be quite a detailed sort of data gathering. Then there needs to be a way of actually translating that data gathering into insights. So like this analysis phase. So how are we going to turn this into, you know, what becomes the knowledge, you know, the insights that we've got. And then based on those insights, you know, what's driving the situation to be the way that it is. And that's, if you want to sort of read up a little bit on the double loop learning, which is going from now we understand the situation the way that it is. And the second loop of the learning would be, why is the situation the way that it is? And that's sort of just the next, you know, exploration, insight gathering phase. And then the last phase would be the change and the improvement. So if I go from the scope to how well do I understand the way that this is, then how well do I understand why is it the way that it is? And then what can I change about those things that are the reason that it's the way that it is? So I never want to try to change the way that it is, because if I don't change the things that are creating that to be the way that it is, then it's not going to be sustainable. There's going to be no meaningful organizational change there. And that's often going to be changing capabilities, roles, structures, business processes, resources, and, you know, organizational priorities, goals, norms, and all of those types of things, which is messy and it's hard, which is why I'd sort of go back to, if you had organizational learning in your safety or human organizational performance strategy for a year, I would like say pick two topics, and define those topics. In the next year, our organizational learning in relation to our human organizational performance strategy is going to focus on organizational change to reshape the way that we function around these two things. And I wouldn't be distracted by events and incidents and you'd have a reason for why you picked those two. But I think that would go into my specification, James, which is, what's the one or two things? What are those scopes? How am I going to understand it? How am I going to understand why it's the way that it is? And then how am I going to change those things that are creating the situation in the organization? So I don't know if that helps a little bit, James, to some extent, but yeah, we can get together and try and write that into a specification if you like.
Okay, if we does anyone want to open your mic or any additional comments in chat for David to answer? And it was rolling on 2 a.m. His local time. Okay, I think I'm going to thank David for especially the time of day or time of evening for him to be able to do that, and his continued support for the Cole learning community over the past number of years. And you know, Jessica is posting in the chat that we have the conference coming up in Columbus. We're also looking for some of our awards winners, and we're looking for nominees. So I encourage you to click on those links and to make some suggestions for our awards this year. Does anyone have any parting comments? I got a whole bunch of thank yous from our guests. This was a thought-provoking session for me. I like the style of just not using PowerPoints and being able to go off of meaningful interactions. So with that, I will part. I hope to see many of you all in Columbus in June. And we appreciate your attendance, and we appreciate David sharing his expertise with all of us.